You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. And welcome back, everyone. We are going to be finishing up Chapter 1 today, going a little bit into Chapter 2. So we're definitely going to finish up the first creation narrative, and we may get into the second one a little bit here today, too. We're going to be addressing fad Bible diets, what constitutes life, Sabbath rest, Eden as the original temple, and a whole lot more. So we got a lot. Let's dive right back in. I'll read verses 26 to 28 just to get us back in the mood of what we're talking about here. So God said, "Let us make human as our image, after our likeness, or according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." This particular word, translated rule or dominion in verse 26, is often noted as having a very harsh connotation of dominating or treading underfoot. It comes across a tad too strong for a lot of people. So it is worth noting that in Hebrew, as with any other language, words have a wide range of meanings. So just because you look up a definition in a dictionary does not automatically mean that that definition is the appropriate one for this word in this context. Context helps us to determine the intended meaning of a word in any given verse. The word can also mean to rule over or to possess. And that's well within legitimate interpretive grounds to choose that definition. Now, in just a second here, I'm going to touch on some possible rationales for why you might take that harsher meaning. But this is just to let you know that there are a couple of different ways people take this. Some will take it to just be talking about ruling over. And that's fine. That is a legitimate definition for this word in this context. But then other people do kind of get hung up on how harsh of a word it is. And I think there may even be a reason for that. So let's talk about that here. A lot of translations are going to have "and over all the earth" in this verse. Let them have dominion over the fish, over the fowl, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and then over every creeping thing. But there's an argument to be made that it should actually be translated "and over the wild beasts of the earth." Let us have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, over all the animals or wild beasts of the earth, and over every creeping thing. And you might go, okay, well, what's the big difference between over all the earth or over all the wild beasts of the earth? Well, to me, the second option makes more sense, because the phrase is surrounded by the animals that humans are supposed to rule over. So it doesn't really make sense that in this list of animals that we rule over, flying things, swimming things, creeping things, we're just going to have tossed in, oh yeah, over all the land. It makes more sense if it's over the wild beasts of the land, because then you have animals in the list of animals. And I think that can even help to explain the use of this harsh word, radah. We are not told to tread on and dominate the land. That's something that people have sometimes used as an excuse to misuse the resources on the earth. You kind of get people with the attitude of, well, the whole thing's just going to burn anyway, so we might as well tear down all these forests, we might as well drill for this resource, and they end up treating the earth like we're just supposed to trample over the entire thing. But we're not supposed to be misusing the resources that we have. We're not supposed to be taking them to the point of extinction. We're not told to dominate over the entire planet. What we are told to rule over in that way is animals. Now, that does not allow for animal cruelty, but I think we have to remember the kinds of animals that we're talking about here. This is about a time when the land was untamed, wild and waste, tohu vavohu. You have creatures like Leviathan and Behemoth, possibly dinosaurs roaming around, depending on whether or not you think that humans and dinosaurs ever crossed over, and where no animals have been domesticated yet. Dogs are still wolves, cats are still lions and tigers, and, well, not bears, but not pets either. So in order to rule the land well, humanity has to wrest control of it from the animals and find a way to live in harmony with nature. Now, today we've taken that to an extreme, where we're not just taking possession of the land and animals, but we're actually often pushing entire species to extinction. That is not all the goal here. The concept of ruling in the story so far comes from how God has ruled the earth, and you don't see him abusing its resources. I think this could also open up the possibility of humans eating animals before the flood. This is something where sometimes people think that humanity was entirely vegetarian before the flood, but the Bible never says that. Now, it is true that after the flood, God gives a statement that humanity will eat meat. But just because God said that after the flood does not mean that humans weren't doing that beforehand. I think there is a case to be made that humans were vegetarians in the garden. I'll actually touch on that a little bit more when we get down to verse 29. But there's a big difference between living in the garden and getting to the time of the flood. There's a lot of time that happens in between there. So I think this idea of dominating over the animals, of ruling over the animals, opens up that possibility as well. So the verse isn't saying kick puppies and destroy animal populations. It's talking about an untamed land where you have wild creatures that need to be domesticated. And we've done that. But nowadays, we're actually on the other end of the spectrum where we're wiping out species and we need to rein it back in. Verse 27 is like a little poem where the second line inverts the first line and then the third line expands on the two. It ends up reading like Yoda wrote it. God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Right? I always end up hearing that verse in Yoda's voice. Male and female created he them. Yes. Anyway, you didn't know you were going to get that today. Something I find interesting here is that these words, male and female, they're not the normal words for male and female. Now, they do mean that. They're just rarer words. Whether or not there's something to that is a matter of debate, but it is odd when the more standard words are used shortly hereafter. Remember, we're reading this story without chapter 2 in mind yet. We're reading forward in the narrative. So pretend that you don't know the story of God's creating Eve from Adam. In this creation account, does God create one or two? The answer is yes. He creates human, that word Adam, but in so doing he's also created more than one. He has created two as one and one as two. In verse 28, we usually call this the creation mandate, but the emphasis is actually on a blessing rather than a command. So I don't really like that terminology because a mandate sounds very much like a command, but that's not the focus here. Even the imperative verbs in this must be read in light of the original benediction. Verse 28 is first and foremost a blessing. God blessed them. So this verse gets taken out of context by a lot of people who are trying to say that God is commanding humans to have lots of kids. Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. There are certain fringe conservative groups that fall under something called the quiverful movement. It's based on one verse out of Psalms that talks about children being like arrows in the quiver of a mighty man. And based on a few misapplied passages, including this one and the Psalms one, they often say that married couples should have as many children as possible. Now, that is absolutely a fringe group, but the teaching trickles down to more mainstream Christianity, where a lot of people who would not consider themselves a part of the quiverful movement end up believing this kind of thing and parroting this kind of teaching. And so a lot of times we end up putting undue pressure on young couples to have children before they're ready. You end up with people who barely know how to live adult life yet on their own, and now they're trying to explain how to do that to little kids. And at the same time, we also trample over those who struggle with infertility and those who don't share the same desire to have children that other people do. There is no scriptural command to have children. Someone is not sinning if they decide not to have children, and if you say that they are, then you have to say that Jesus sinned, because he never married and he never had kids. Unless you're Dan Brown, but that's another podcast episode for another day. We have to remember this is first and foremost a blessing. It's not a command. We are free to populate the earth with God's approval, but that doesn't mean that every single one of us has to immediately pop out as many kids as possible. If a young man asked for a father's blessing on his upcoming marriage, we would not then say that he is required to marry the girl. Something could come up in the meantime, and they could break it off. That's okay. The blessing of the father there is not the same thing as requiring a marriage. The young man now has the approval, he has the blessing, but if for whatever reason they choose to call it off, he's not disobeying or disrespecting the girl's father. We have to consider the purpose of verses like this in the Bible. Narratively, this is placed at the start of the human race. People needed to have lots of kids in order for there to be enough people on the earth at all. And even by the time of Jesus, the mortality rate for kids was not great. If you had 10 kids, you might have 6 that lived to adulthood. You were probably going to see about 40% die. So, of course you're going to have as many of them as you can because you need them to carry on your line. So if you only have 1 or 2 kids in Bible times, you're running a pretty big risk of having them die before they reach adulthood and are able to start their own families. So, of course, a lot of these families had as many kids as possible, just in order to make sure that they had enough to carry the line on. Not to mention, most of them worked family businesses where they pretty much just needed free or cheap labor. I might add as well that those children were often from multiple wives, but we don't like to bring that part up in most of our discussions today. Now, I want to be clear. I do believe that kids can be a blessing. And I don't believe that there's anything wrong with having kids at all. There are two different extremes you can go to. There are people who would say, why would you ever have kids? The Earth's overpopulated. The Earth's going to hell in a handbasket. Why would you ever bring a kid into that? I understand the concerns there, but I think that can end up on an extreme side. Then you also have the extreme that goes, well, we should just have as many kids as we possibly can, and we're going to try to take over the world with an army of Christian kids for God. And that's also an extreme. That's not the purpose of this verse. This is a blessing for people to be able to have kids if they are biologically able to, and if they are on the same page together. So kids are good, but it is not a command from God to have as many kids as possible. That is a pretty abusive teaching and leaves a lot of damage in its wake. I'll also just touch on here really quickly. There was an idea, it was more popular a couple hundred years ago. It doesn't have too much of a following today, but some people would look at the phrasing of the King James especially and see where it says to replenish the earth. God says, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. And since today replenish means to refill, they would say that this was actually like a second creation. It ended up in this whole convoluted thing where some people actually believe that God made a first creation. Something went horribly wrong with it that left it formless and void, tohu vavohu, that you have at the very start of our story, and then this is God's starting over. So thus he says replenish the earth, refill it, because the last time didn't work out so well. And if you think this is some sort of weird, fringe, crazy conspiracy theory, find a Scofield study Bible, because Scofield believed this, and it's in those notes. So if you have a Scofield study Bible, check out what he has on these verses in Genesis, and you'll actually find that theory. It's pretty whack, actually, because just a quick check on that word replenish takes that possibility away. Yes, today, though, the English word replenish means to refill, but in the 1600s, when the King James was written, the word simply meant to fill. And if you check the Hebrew word behind it, malah, it just means to fill. So there's no reason to see this as a second filling of the earth. It was a theory that was popular a couple hundred years ago when people were first being confronted with evolution, and they were trying to find ways to reconcile their Christian belief with prevailing science of the time. But today, as we've become more familiar with the culture of the Bible, we can see how those positions just aren't plausible anymore. An interesting thing about that word for fill, though, that Hebrew word malah, it has a priestly consecration aspect to it. When you get way down the road to the tabernacle and then eventually the temple, when they're constructed, they are malad, they are filled with the Spirit of God. And the priests malah, they consecrate those structures for sacred service. So several scholars surmise from this language that we are to imagine Eden as a temple, with the man and the woman as the priests of this first temple. A temple is a meeting place of heaven and earth. It is where God comes down and humans go up. That's why a lot of times temples were on mountains or on top of hills, just some sort of high altitude, because humans are going up, gods are coming down, we are meeting. It's like we're united, again, like we were in the garden. And so I think there are a lot of hints in this passage, and I'll try to touch on them as we get to them. But there are a lot of hints here that Eden is pictured as a cosmic temple. That doesn't mean that there was actually a building that looked like a temple, but that this was like a temple without walls, and Adam and Eve were the priests of it. Now, something important to notice in this verse is that all of the verbs are plural. In other words, men and women are both being called to rule the earth together. It's not just the man being called to rule the earth and then the woman to rule the house. That's a framework that I have heard before, but it's not based in the Bible. Right here, you have God blessing both the man and the woman, and he is telling both of them, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over all of these animals. So there is no headship mentioned here, no extra authority given to the man. Now, I understand this is a touchy topic for a lot of people, and a lot of good Christians end up on both sides of an issue here. But just to dip our toes into the waters of this debate a little bit, there are Christians who take a position known as complementarianism, and then there are other Christians who take a position known as egalitarianism. Complementarians tend to be on a more conservative side most of the time, not always, but a lot of times, and they're going to say that there is a fundamental difference between the roles that men and women have. They are equal in importance, but men are just gifted 99% of the time in leadership, and women are gifted 99% of the time in being able to serve and be a help to the men in leadership. It's an oversimplification, but that's ultimately what it comes down to. Men are given leadership authority from God, and women are to submit to the men in their lives. That can go south very fast when you're saying that women are meant to submit to men, but the more balanced people in those circles will at least acknowledge that the Bible does not say women submit to men, it says wives submit to the husbands. So that is not to say that all women have to submit to all men, but rather wives to husbands specifically. The egalitarian position comes from the other angle and says that yes, men and women can be good at different things. More often than not, a woman is going to be perhaps a little bit gentler in raising children, or more often than not, perhaps a man is going to have a stronger physical build. So he might be involved in more physical labor, and she might be involved in more nurturing labor, or whatever you would have there. But that does not mean that they can't do the same roles. It would be appropriate from an egalitarian perspective for women and men to have equal roles, not just equal importance, but equal roles. It's okay for women to be in leadership in one form or another. It's okay if a woman is better at finances, that she do the finances for the home. She pays the bills. It's okay if you have a stay-at-home dad and a mom who goes out to work. Especially post-COVID-19, with a lot of people working from home, that really did kind of change things up, where you ended up with a lot of people who would say they had complementarian values, but they were actually living out basically an egalitarian lifestyle. So for an egalitarian, they would say that men and women are equal. It is not that women in any situation have to submit to men solely based on what genitalia you were born with. It is that all humans are created equal, and that no one sex was appointed by God to rule over others. That both men and women can lead and are meant to lead in the areas that they are gifted in. So I'm not looking to settle that here today by any means, but I will say that I grew up with that complementarian mindset, that men lead, women follow. And the older I've gotten and the more that I've studied the Bible, the more I lean on an egalitarian position, where I think that God's ideal is for all humans to be of equal status. And that doesn't mean that you don't sometimes have a man leading. It happens. It doesn't mean that sometimes you don't have a woman leading. That happens. But you go based on what you're gifted on in a particular scenario. And the reason that I've leaned that way is because I believe that as you study out these first 2 chapters of Genesis, before you get to chapter 3, before you get to eating from the fruit, there is no mention whatsoever of male headship. Nothing. The only time that that comes in, and we'll get to this, believe me, but the only time that that comes in is after the fall. So I see complementarianism and the idea of men being appointed by God to lead over women in general. I don't mean specific men, but the idea of the male sex being born leaders over women. That is a post-fall story. And we'll get to that when we get there in chapter 3. But as we're here in this Eden ideal, what God established is for men and women to rule together in harmony. Now, I know there are other passages that have to enter the debate. And I know some of you are even thinking of some of those passages already. We'll get to those when we get to the fall narrative in chapter 3. So hold on to your horses with that. But I just wanted to draw attention to that fact, to put it in your mind as we're studying these first 2 chapters, because I know a lot of assumptions can be made, and we can read things like male headship and sex and gender roles into these stories, when if we actually just step back and remove the lens of our assumptions, we can see that it's not quite the narrative that the Bible is telling. Alright, that is enough controversy for the moment. So let's get into verse 29. And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of the tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creeps upon the earth, wherein there is life. I have given every green herb for meat. And it was so. Whenever you have something like, and behold, show up in the Bible, like we have here at the start of this verse, and God said, Behold. It's like when you're watching a movie and the camera zooms in on the main character or on some action that's about to take place. It's drawing you into the perspective of the character, pointing your focus to a specific part of the scene. So whenever you see that word behold, or sometimes the King James would have it as lo, L-O, or just something like that where it's the narrator stepping out of character for a second. It's like he's looking at you and saying, hey, pay attention to what's happening. This is about to be important. Just a little narrative note there. Now, the word meat that shows up here, it's kind of an unfortunate translation now because today we only use meat to refer to, like, beef, specific kinds of food, but the word actually just means food in general, not pork and steak and venison, just food in general. And most people take this verse to mean that humanity was originally vegetarian. And that is possible, but as we pointed out before, it would be inaccurate to say that humanity did not eat meat before the flood. First off, we have to note that this is not a command. Second, this is pre-fall. There's a lot of time between where we are now and when the flood happens. So just because something may have happened pre-fall doesn't mean that that couldn't have changed in the time between the fall and the flood. And third, humanity was given rulership over the animals by God. And a couple chapters later, we'll see that Abel brings an animal sacrifice, which I think implies that animals were likely eaten before the flood. Now, it's not specifically said there, but a lot of times when you get into the sacrificial system later in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, the animal that was sacrificed was eaten. So I think it can be read in there. Either way, I don't think it makes a huge difference, and God does allow for eating meat both in the flood and in Acts. So humanity very well may have been vegetarian before the fall. But I draw attention to this because there are these fad diets that pop up every so often based in Bible passages that are taken out of context. And they usually spread around churches, and they try to convince people that there is a specific best diet based on some Bible passage. So you'll get some people who try to say that, well, because Adam and Eve in the garden were vegetarian, we're supposed to be too. Yeah, I've got nothing wrong with being vegetarian. If that's what you like, if that's what you choose, that can be a healthy way of living. But that does not mean that that is God's ideal for us. I don't think that you're supposed to say this is the only way that can ever happen. Daniel diet is another one that pops up every so often, trying to base it on the food that Daniel and his friends ate at the start of the book. And you'll get some others from time to time. Amusingly enough, people don't usually try to make diets based on Ezekiel or John the Baptist, but that's a whole other matter for another day. I just like to draw attention to this because the Bible is not trying to give you a recipe book for how to eat the healthiest way. It's trying to tell you a story about the redemption of humanity. Now, if you personally choose to go off of a certain diet, totally fine. Just don't claim that this is what God wants or thinks is best based on a Bible verse taken out of context. That is not an appropriate use of the passage. Okay, rant over. Notice how these instructions are concerning the entirety of the earth. It's not just the garden. He's talking about this being over every beast of the land. We have to remember that God didn't just create the garden. He created the whole land, the whole world. And again, they're not thinking of a globe, but whatever the expanse of land was outside of the garden as well. So humanity wasn't intended to stay in the garden. We were supposed to take the created order that God established in the garden and move it forward through the rest of the world. I think the picture of the Bible is that God creates a good creation and a very orderly garden, but that the rest of the world still has some elements of wild and wasteness to it. You still have animals that need to be tamed. You still have forests that need to be cleared out. You still have chaos water that needs to be utilized in a useful way. So our job is to make the rest of the earth look like Eden. As we get into verse 30, I want to draw attention to the use of that word life. It's the Hebrew word nephesh. And I think we touched on this before, how it means throat originally, and the connection there is that, well, if you cut someone's throat, they no longer have life. And you would even say maybe their soul leaves their body. So you have this dynamic range of meaning with this word nephesh, where in some cases it can just mean throat, or it can even mean the soul, the spiritual aspect of somebody, or it can just mean in general their life. So from this, we have to observe that the Bible actually has a very different definition of what constitutes life than we do. Now, it could be easy to read over this, so don't miss this. God gives rulership to the man and the woman over the beasts of the earth, the fowl of the air, the creeping things. All those things, verse 30 says, have life. And all of those things are allowed to eat plants. Now, that should tell you there is a difference between plants and animal and human life. Biblically speaking, plants are not alive. Remember, this is not a science textbook. This is not trying to speak scientifically. We're coming from an ancient perspective here, and we're just dealing with within the Bible's framework. Whenever I tend to think of life as a modern American, I imagine something like one of those Discovery Channel documentaries where you see seeds on a time lapse growing into plants, or I picture maybe trees blowing in the wind. But in the Bible, only creatures that breathe outside air through their lungs, or a similar system like gills and fish, are considered to be alive, to have nephesh, to have a soul, a spiritual side, life. So while we tend to think that plants, animals, and humans all have life, biblically speaking, plants don't have that spiritual side, so they are not alive. They don't have nephesh. Animals do, and humans do as well, but plants do not. So this gets into the whole question of death and life in the garden, because most Christians would say that there was no death prior to the fall. And if that is true, then you have to consider, how is it okay that animals and humans could eat plants, because isn't that taking life? Now, not life in the same sense of human life, but if we think of plants as alive, you kind of have to wrestle with that a little bit, and it's not something I think many people have considered. But the Bible already kind of answers that by presenting nephesh as the definition of life. And so since plants don't have nephesh, they are not considered alive, they are fair game for eating in the garden. So the difference between plants and animals, from a biblical perspective, is nephesh. Animals have nephesh, life. Plants do not. The difference between animals and humans, from the biblical perspective, is the image of God. So plants don't have nephesh, animals do, humans do as well. Humans alone are the image of God. So that's the difference between those three categories. And so now we reach the end of chapter 1. God saw everything that he made. Behold, it was very good. In Hebrew, the word good is tov. We've seen that show up several times, but now it is tov ma'od. It is very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Now, I realize we come from a time well after the garden, but I believe that this declaration over creation still stands. Even after the fall, we never get anything in the Bible that says creation is no longer good, or humanity is no longer good. As far as God is concerned, his creation is still very good. Now, yes, it is imperfect, but it was imperfect then too. Remember what we talked about in the very first episode of the stuff you don't know about Genesis? Good does not mean perfect. There is nothing in this story that says that the garden was perfect. You can't improve on perfect. But we were supposed to improve on the garden. We were supposed to take that creative order and spread it throughout the entire world and continue on new discoveries and inventions and technologies. So it's true that the world is not perfect, but it wasn't perfect then either. And there was the potential for things to go wrong then, just like there is today. So I think we can still look at this verse and say that creation is still very good. You are still very good in God's eyes. I know for some people that can be hard to accept when they've heard that the message of the Bible is just constantly about God looking down on them in anger, and the only reason God doesn't strike you down is because of Jesus. I don't think that's a healthy perspective to take, and I don't think that's the message of the Bible. The impression that God has of his creation, including humanity, including you, is that it is very good. And so, as one of my college professors used to say, if I can quit preaching and go to meddling for a second, what would it look like for you if you saw the world as very good today? How might that change the interactions that you have with other people? If you consider that that person who's just driving you up a wall is the image of God, and they're good in God's eyes. Now, it doesn't mean that everything they do is good, but God still looks on them as good. If you're a parent and you have a child, chances are that not everything that kid does is good, or that you approve of. But that doesn't mean that you look on the child with disfavor just because they've messed up too many times this week. You still love them. You still probably think they're a good kid overall. You know, how many times do you hear a parent, even if the kid is just the worst behaved child you've ever seen, what do they say? He's still a good kid at heart. Why? Because they're the parent, they're the one who knows them better than anyone else, and they know the potential that that child has, even when they make mistakes. Well, that's the way that God views you, and other humans as well. Yeah, you might mess up, yeah, you might have issues, you're not perfect, but you're still good. I think if we can take that mindset into the world with us, into the workforce, into the chores that we have to do around the house, then maybe just maybe, we might be able to view the world the way that God does and view other people the way that God does, with love. That's a powerful message that the Bible has, and it's something that is still really applicable for today. Okay, getting back into the text here, because if you remember, I said that just because chapter 1 has ended does not mean that this first creation story has ended. We actually still have a little bit more to go. We have to cut into chapter 2. So let's read the first couple verses here. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he made, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had made. And God blessed the seventh day, he sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all the work which God created and made. So this is actually where most people would say chapter 1 should end, is 3 verses into chapter 2 here. So we're going to cover this, and then we'll actually get a little bit into the true start of chapter 2. Just like we had at the very beginning of the creation story here, an introductory phrase, this is kind of the conclusion. So here we have just the whole story of this week of creation being wrapped up. And it says that God created the heavens and the earth, remember that's the skies and the land, and all the host of them. That word host is a military term, and it's often used to describe even a large group of supernatural beings, of stars and planets. You might recognize the phrase the Lord of Hosts, or the heavenly host. So I think this is playing kind of a dual function here in this verse. It could just be saying God created the skies and the land and all of the creatures that swarm around in them. But I think there's also a second meaning of the creation of spiritual beings, probably on day 4, and specifically on verse 16, when it's talking about God's creating the stars, since we talked about how ancient cultures connected the celestial realm with the spiritual realm. Some people would throw in Job 38:7 and say that since the term morning stars and sons of God both refer to spiritual beings and they're described as shouting in joy at creation, that spiritual beings were actually created before day 1 of creation and they witnessed the whole thing. Ultimately, we don't know for sure when spiritual beings were created because they're not the focus of this story. This is talking about creating a world where humans can thrive. So whether you say that they were created before day 1, on day 1, day 4, it really doesn't make that much of a difference at the end of the day. Day 2 explains to us that God ends his work and rests on the Sabbath. Now that word 7, as well as rest, are spelled with the same root letters in Hebrew. Another word that comes from those same root letters is complete. Actually, a different word, complete, than what's here in this verse. But those concepts are all tied together. So there's a word play going on that God completed and he rested on the 7th day, with all of those words coming from the same root, so they all kind of sound the same. And this is where we get the Hebrew word Sabbath. You might be familiar with the concept of Sabbath being the day of rest. And in Christian culture, sometimes it gets meshed between Saturday and Sunday, since Christians worship on Sunday rather than Saturday. But in a Jewish context, the Sabbath day is the 7th day. Saturday. That's why you even have a Seventh-day Adventist church where they would worship on Saturday instead of Sunday, because they're going to be basing it off of this Old Testament concept of the 7th day being the holy day, the one in which God rested. And so that word Sabbath is related to the same word. Like the word for rest is Shavuot. And so you have God Shavuoting on the 7th day, which becomes the Shabbat. Sabbath. This kind of wordplay continues throughout the Tanakh. In Exodus 16:3, you have the Hebrews complaining that they no longer had the fullness, the Sabbath, that they experienced in Egypt. So God gives them food on every day except for the Shabbat, the 7th day, which is Shavuot. Sabbath. So it just kind of all plays together of this concept of the 7th day being the Sabbath day where you Shavuot, you rest. But let's consider this concept of rest. We don't want to rush past this. How exactly does a god rest? What did that look like? Did he just take a nap? Did he watch his favorite movie? Play a video game? Go for a walk? Like, what does this mean that God rested? And what if Adam needed him that day? These are questions that we don't always think about, but that we should be asking. Rest in the Bible is not often about taking a nap. Now, it can be taking a nap, it can be doing something relaxing, but it has more the idea of purposefully taking time to step aside from something you've been working on in order to reset yourself. I think this is the concept that Jesus had of rest. He specifically carved out time for himself, but if people needed him, he made time for them. In fact, we see this several times in the Gospels where Jesus tries to get away from the crowds, but someone comes with a need, and he takes the time to help. After all, as he even said, the Sabbath is for humanity, not humans, for the Sabbath. Rest was made for us. I can't imagine that God would have told Adam to wait until Sunday or Monday if he had a problem. I'm out of office right now, call back on Monday. It was more like God was out of office, but his phone was always on, if we can put it in modern terms. See, rest isn't so much about God's being tired, like he was exhausted from all the physical exertion of creation. Rest is actually the idea of his sitting back and enjoying the beauty of his creation. When a king sits on his throne in a time of peace, he's said to be resting on the throne. Now, that doesn't mean that he's taking a nap. It means that he's sitting back and doesn't have to worry about some administrative task right now. He's able to just rule over his kingdom. And that's the picture here. It's not that God was laying down to sleep. It's that he was sitting on his heavenly throne, surveying the beauty and the goodness of his new creation. From another angle, we can even consider other times that God is said to rest in Scripture. When God's glory fills the tabernacle and the temple, his Spirit is said to be resting there. And here, I think the implication is that his glory fills the entire earth, that he is actually taking up residence within creation, that he is filling the earth with his presence. God's rest at the start of Genesis 2 is about filling a sacred space with his divine presence and celebrating the beauty and abundance of creation. The Sabbath practice is a way for us humans to remember God's presence and his ideal purpose for creation. It's a way of stopping every week and reminding ourselves that the world will go on without us. We live in a culture where rest is not common. Now, yes, we may talk about it, yes, we may like rest, but most of us are actually overworking ourselves. It's really hard to step back and do truly nothing. How many times are we watching a movie or a sports game and we're still on our phones checking something? Or we're on a walk with family, but we're actually thinking about the project that we have to finish on Monday. That's not rest. True Sabbath rest is about stopping and not working. Not even thinking about working, just enjoying the moment that you're in. Because when we do that, we get to see that the world continues on without us. Work will still be there on Monday. If you take a day off on Monday, work will still be there on Tuesday. The company is not going to fall under. If you have a day where not all of the cleaning in the house gets done, well, the house is still going to be there tomorrow to clean. We get so focused on ourselves, thinking that the world revolves around us, and if we don't do X, well, everything's just going to fall apart. But rest reminds us that we're not actually that important. God is the one who holds the world together, not you. So I think that this restful Sabbath day does not have to mean that every Saturday you do absolutely nothing. I know there are some people who would take that literally and say, okay, we just have to have a day where we do absolutely nothing. I don't think that's the case, and for most people, that just doesn't end up happening. Saturday is, basically the only true day off of work a lot of people have. So even then, they're taking their kids to sports games or they're doing grocery shopping or what have you. And for a lot of Christians who are going to be going to church on Sunday, if we're being honest, that's actually not a day of rest. Especially if you're in a church that has both a morning and an evening service, that's not a restful day. And I think with a lot of churches, the kinds of sermons that you hear actually are not very restful either. They tend to contribute to stress. Think of the stereotype of the family yelling at each other on the way to church. And then, they sit nice and happy and like good little Christians in the front pew on Sunday morning. And then as soon as they get back out in the car, they start fighting again. That's not rest. But I don't think you have to take a whole day to do this. I think it can be spread out. I don't think the concept of Sabbath has to be rigid. If you're keeping a rigid routine of Sabbath, you're kind of missing the purpose of Sabbath. It's not supposed to be rigid. It's just supposed to be when you need it, you take time to step away and just be. Just focus on existence. Just focus on where you are. Enjoy the little things. Take a quick walk outside, or sit back with a good book and your favorite cup of tea or coffee. And when you do, a lot of times you're going to find that you actually have an averse reaction to that kind of slowdown. Your mind is going to race. You're going to start thinking of all the things you have to do. That's normal, and it shows you how much we're not in tune with the need for rest. I like how John Walton said, the Sabbath is most truly honored when we participate in the work of God. So, me speaking here for a second, that means that you can be enjoying Sabbath rest even while working. But then there comes times when you have to step aside from that and just take time to focus on rest. Back to Walton's quote, the work we desist from is that which represents our own attempts to bring our own order to our lives. It is to resist our self-interest, our self-sufficiency, and our sense of self-reliance. I think that's beautiful. Now, we have talked a little bit about the garden being like the temple, the original temple of God. Now, let's think for a minute about what it means for the garden to be like a temple. We just talked about how God's presence filled both the tabernacle and the temple, and it's a representation of his approval of those structures for his presence. And we have that here in the garden as well. I think it's also worth noting that ancient temples were often dedicated in a 7-day ceremony. We see this even in Leviticus 8, 1 Kings 8, and Ezekiel 43. Now, this might seem like a little bit of an abstract concept or not that important, but I think the idea of the garden as a temple is actually extremely important in understanding this narrative in 2 ways. The first one is it helps us to understand God's reaction to Adam and Eve's failure, and then it also helps to explain the mission of Jesus. So let's talk about those 2 really quickly here. How can understanding the garden as a temple help us make sense of the punishment that Adam and Eve receive in chapter 3? Sometimes people complain that God was too harsh on Adam and Eve. Like, all they did was eat from a fruit. Sure, they didn't follow your command, but that's just one little thing, and now you're saying all of humanity is banished from paradise? Like, what's the big deal, God? But when we consider that the garden was a temple, and Adam and Eve were priests in that temple, it makes what happens make more sense. See, there are other passages in Scripture where quick judgments occur after something goes wrong in a temple setting. The first one that I think of is Leviticus 10. This is right after the construction of the tabernacle. Aaron and his sons have been appointed as the priests, and day 1 on the job, Aaron's sons, Nadav and Abihu, decide we are going to do this our way. And so they offer what the Bible calls strange fire, and they are very quickly struck dead. It is a horrifying narrative to read. And a lot of people look at that as being a little harsh on God's part. So keep that in mind as we are considering this story here in Genesis 3. There's another one that I thought of, and this is actually in Acts 5. After Pentecost, the church is beginning, and you have this story told of a couple who decide that they're going to sell a lot of goods that they have, and they're going to donate a large portion of that to the church. But they are also going to keep part of it back for themselves. All well and good, no problem. The problem comes in that this couple decides they are going to tell the church that they gave all of the profits. In other words, they're lying on their taxes, basically, but to the church. So as soon as they give the proceeds, Peter confronts them and asks if they have given everything. And, of course, they both decide to lie and say, yes, we did. And they are both struck dead immediately. Yet another passage where judgment comes quickly, and people start to scratch their heads and go, that does not seem fair. So let's consider these 3 passages all together. They all have God passing harsh, swift judgment after 2 people decide to do something. So let's consider all of these stories together. All 3 of them take place after the institution of something new. Here in Genesis, you have the institution of creation as a whole. You have Adam and Eve as priest and priestess over this garden temple. Leviticus 10, you have the tabernacle just being constructed. Acts 5 is right after Pentecost and the start of the church. All of these stories have God passing swift, harsh judgment on 2 of his representatives who decide to do something their own way, a different way than what he established previously. All well and good, but that can leave you thinking that God is just really quick to pass judgment on people and that he really acts out when he doesn't get his way. But let's consider what a temple would have meant in an ancient context. A temple was the meeting place of heaven and earth. The ancients believed it's where the presence of a god would have lived. Now, we are humans. We do not exist on the spiritual realm. We exist on a physical realm. And bad things happen when the spiritual and physical realms cross over. That's not usually a good thing. Think about whenever an angel appears in the Bible. Pretty much immediately they have to say, fear not, don't be afraid. Why? Because they're not physical beings. We're not used to seeing angels. And when a person sees an angel in the Bible, they freak because they realize this isn't normal. This isn't natural. This isn't something from my physical realm. I kind of view it like outer space. Is space good or bad? Neither. It's neutral. There is nothing morally good or bad about outer space. But what if you blinked your eyes and all of a sudden you were in space? You would freak out really fast because humans can't live in space. We're meant to live on the earth. And yet, we have sent humans to space. How? Because we've created a buffer between the elements of space that will kill you and your own body. So there is something buffering between that realm of outer space and you. And it's providing this little mini space where you can exist in ideal conditions so that you do not die out there. We call it a spacesuit. That's kind of the way it is with the spiritual realm. The spiritual realm is not a good or a bad thing, but we in our natural forms are not intended to exist in a spiritual realm. So whenever humans in the Bible come into contact with a being from the spiritual realm, they freak because they realize, I'm probably going to die right now. Like if you suddenly woke up in space, you would be scared of dying. Humans require some sort of a buffer substance to keep them alive in a spiritual space. This is a really complex topic and something that I'll continue to flesh out a little bit in future studies. But I like to introduce us to it here because I think it helps us make sense of this temple theme in the garden and why God passed judgment the way that he did on the man and the woman. If you go up into space without a spacesuit, you are going to die. Now, no one would say that you were punished for that. No one would say that is God's judgment on you. It's just, if you go into space without the proper equipment, you're not going to be able to live. It's not punishment. It's not saying you did something morally wrong. That's just the way it is. You can't exist in that area without the proper protection. And I think that's the way it works with the spiritual realm as well. When people cross over into it, they die. That's why you have that story of Uzzah from 2 Samuel when David is bringing the Ark of the Covenant back into Jerusalem. And you have a guy, his name was Uzzah. He sees that the Ark is about to tip over on the cart that's on, and so he reaches out his hand on it and is immediately struck dead. And a lot of people go, why in the world would God kill him? He was only trying to protect the cart. I think that he just died because he didn't have the capacity to exist in the same space as that Ark of the Covenant. When he touched it, he crossed that spiritual realm and was immediately struck dead just because his physical form couldn't handle it. It wasn't God saying, how dare you try to do something right, I'm going to kill you. There was a warning that God had placed against touching the Ark, not because he would kill you if you touched it, but because your physical form just simply couldn't handle it. And that's why there were very, very, very specific instructions that the priests had to follow in the temple and in the transportation of the Ark. Not because God is an OCD, nitpicky kind of person who wants things done exactly his way, but because God knew if you do not do it exactly this way, you are going to die. We kind of have that illustrated in the first Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark. At the end of the movie, the Nazis have taken the Ark, and the one reaches out to open the Ark, and they are immediately destroyed in a relatively graphic fashion, especially for the time that the movie came out. I think that's kind of the idea, is it's not that God is immediately punishing anyone who touched the Ark. It's that his presence was connected to that as it being almost like a portal between the physical and spiritual realms. And so if you in your natural form touch that, you are crossing into space without a spacesuit. That's not to say that space is bad. That's the pattern that the Bible sets, that humans have their realm and that spiritual beings have their realm. And yes, they can cross, but when they do, without the proper precautions, humans' physical form just cannot handle it, and so the person immediately dies. It's not punishment as much as just consequences. Dying in space is not a punishment, but it would be a consequence of not doing things the way that they need to be done in order for you to live. So God's very strict instructions that fill Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, they are not because God is nitpicky. They're because he's saying, what you're doing is crossing between realms here. And if you do that without taking the proper steps, you will die. I do not want you to die. So here's the way to do it. We look at these passages where God says, do X and you will die, and we think he's a little harsh. But what if he's not threatening as much as just speaking truthfully? Do X and you will die. Not in the sense of I'm going to kill you, but in the sense of it will kill you. I could say, don't stick a fork in an electrical outlet, or you might die. That doesn't mean that I'm threatening to kill you. It means that I'm telling you there is a potential of severe electrocution if you do that. I think that's the way that the Bible works here. So all of these instances of Adam and Eve, Nadav and Avihu, and Ananias and Sapphira, their deaths are so sudden and so graphic. It's not because God is being a sadist or acting out of turn. It's that they are just getting the consequences of not following the warnings that he gave. If you're taking a tour of a nuclear reactor and you have a whole panel of buttons in front of you and the tour guide says, whatever you do, do not press that one button. You're not going to think that the tour guide is lame and just trying to keep you from having fun. You're going to think, he probably knows what he's talking about. I don't work in a nuclear reactor, so I probably shouldn't touch that button. That's the way that this is in the Bible. God gives these specific instructions, and he says, if you don't do this, you will die. Not to threaten, but to warn. And since Adam and Eve, Nadav and Avihu, and Ananias and Sapphira did not listen to the instructions, they died. So I think that helps us to understand a little bit of this, that this is not a harsh, punitive God of the Old Testament just acting out of turn. It's the same God of love that we have through the entire Bible and all of human history, saying there is a best way to do things. And there is also a way to do things that will get you killed. I don't recommend doing it that way. And then sometimes we get stories of humans who decide to do it that way anyway, and they do experience death. Now, keeping all of that in mind, let's pivot into how the idea of the garden as a temple helps you understand the mission of Jesus. If we jump all the way ahead to John chapter 1, verse 14, John writes that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld his glory, the glory as the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. That word dwelt, it's the word skenao. It's the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word for tabernacle. Tabernacle in the Bible is not just a noun. It's not just the tent. It's also a verb. God tabernacled with the Israelites in the wilderness. It means that he pitched his tent with them. He decided to live with them. So what we have here in John 1:14 is an allusion to that. The author is saying that God took on human form and he tabernacled with us. So by drawing that connection, John is hyperlinking the story of Jesus to the presence of God that we saw in the tabernacle and the temple. So here at the very beginning of John's gospel, he is telling you that Jesus is like the tabernacle or the temple of God. He is where heaven and earth meet. He is where God comes down and lives with humans in order to try to right the wrongs of humanity and bring us back to Eden. That is what the temple was. That is what the tabernacle was. And that is what Jesus was. And as the story in John's gospel continues, Jesus actually says that the Spirit of God that filled the tabernacle and the temple and Eden is going to live within his followers. So the presence of God is no longer going to be in a fixed building, but rather it's going to be in all people who live out this way of Jesus. So then everybody who lives out the way of Yahweh becomes a tabernacle, a traveling presence of God on earth. If we can fast forward then into Paul's writings, he says that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And we can get lost on that because a lot of times preachers try to then say what you should and shouldn't do with your body based on that idea. We miss the absolutely mind-blowing ramifications of that statement. You are the temple. You are the meeting place of heaven and earth. You are where God came down to live in order to help make the earth more like Eden, in order to fix our mess and get back to an Eden ideal or something even better than Eden. God had to come down in human form, and he did that 2,000 years ago, but he still does that today too, and it's in you and me. So then the choices that we make every day are an opportunity for us to bring a little piece of Eden life and abundance and blessing into the world. That's beautiful. That's powerful. That will change the way that you live every day. Now let's notice what's missing here in chapter 2, verse 3. The day is never said to end. In every other day of creation, you have in the evening and the morning were the first day, second day, third day, so forth and so on. But you never get that on day 7. It never says the evening and the morning were the 7th day. And I think that's to say that God's 7th day rest never ended. It's still going on today. God is resting as king over his creation. And that means that he can rest and work at the same time. And he invites us to do the same with him. That even as we work, even as we do our mundane daily activities, we can find Sabbath rest as we live out this ideal of our own being little mini Edens of God's blessing on the rest of the world. That is beautiful. And we will end on that for this week. Next week, we will pick it up in verse 4 and continue with some really fascinating discussions of the second creation narrative. But until then, remember to stay curious and keep asking questions about the uncut and unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, be sure to share it with a friend. You can also rate and review on your podcast app to help other people find it. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can subscribe at patreon.com/thebibleuncut, where you'll get exclusive access to bonus content. You can also check out our website, thebibleuncut.com, for recommended resources and more. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.